The kettle whistled behind me, sharp and shrill, but I didn't move. I stood frozen in the kitchen, fingers curled loosely around the rim of a chipped mug. The tea had gone cold. I hadn't taken a sip. "They're renovating the house already," my aunt said lightly, tossing the words over her shoulder as she scrolled through something on her phone. I blinked. "What house?" She looked up. "Your grandmother's. They're doing the floors, I think, repainting the porch." I saw it on one of those fancy real estate pages. My skin prickled. There was only one house she could have meant. The white brick, 2-story on Sycamore Hill, with the green shutters and the rose vines that clung stubbornly to the gate. The house I hadn't set foot in since the funeral. Since I locked the door and whispered, "I'll come back when I'm ready." I'd spent every summer of my childhood there. That house smelled like lemon polish and lavender powder. It was where I learned to braid my hair and bake shortbread and grieve in silence after my mother died. That house was hers, my grandmother's. And when she passed, it became mine. She told me so. I laughed too sharply. "No, that's not possible." My aunt gave me a funny look. "Didn't your father tell you? They sold it last month. Got a great price, too. Something in the millions. Good timing with the market." She shrugged like it was weather talk. Like she hadn't just struck a match and dropped it into my chest. My breath caught. They sold it?" She raised an eyebrow. "Well, it wasn't going to just sit there forever, was it?" I left before the tea could stain the cup. I tore through drawers when I got home. Bottom cabinets, shoeboxes, anything where I might have tucked the only thing that mattered now, the letter. The original letter from the lawyer. The one I received weeks after the funeral. A thick envelope with my full name typed on the front. Too heavy for junk, too intentional to be forgotten. I found it wedged behind old receipts and a broken tape measure in the bottom drawer of my nightstand. The seal was already broken, probably by me, back when grief made everything taste like cardboard. But now I read it again with fresh eyes. There it was, Clause the 3rd. "The house located at 18 Sycamore Hill is to be passed in full ownership to my granddaughter, Sophia Aline Ward. My name. My full name. Underlined by the lawyer's pen." I flipped to the last page. Her signature. The date. The notarization. Everything was legal. Everything was binding. So why had they sold it? I grabbed my phone. Called my father. No answer. I called again. Voicemail. I sent a text. "Call me. Urgent. Read." No reply. I messaged my older brother, Adam. "What's going on with Grandma's house? I just found out it was sold." Read. No reply. That silence, sudden, coordinated, and complete, told me more than any confession ever could. I opened my laptop, heart pounding, and typed the address into Google. The third listing down showed it. Elegant historic property sold, $4,000 and $50,000. My stomach flipped. There were photos. They'd taken down the old shutters. The rose vines had been ripped away. The porch light had been replaced with some polished chrome monstrosity. I scrolled through the gallery like I was watching someone else's nightmare. I knew every corner of that house. The blue tile in the guest bathroom. The clawfoot tub I used to read in for hours. The linen drapes my grandmother hand-stitched before arthritis took her hands. Gone. Or scrubbed. Or sold. They'd erased me from the one place I had left. I closed the laptop. The world swam. I wasn't naive. I knew. They resented me. I'd always been the outlier. The quiet one. The daughter of the mother they whispered about when they thought I couldn't hear. But I never thought they'd do this. Not like this. Not without a word. Not behind my back. And worse, they must have known I'd find out eventually. They just didn't care. because they didn't believe I'd do anything. I stood up too fast, knocking over the cold tea. It spread across the table like blood. I stared at it for a long moment before grabbing a towel. As I wiped it up, I heard the kettle again. Still screaming. Still waiting. But I didn't move. My name is Sophia. I'm 28 years old, and everything I thought I'd inherited, every childhood memory, every promise whispered in a dying woman's voice, had been taken from me, stolen, fenced for millions, by the very people who told me I was family. But they never checked the fine print. They never read the right letter, and they had no idea what I was about to do. They used to call me the quiet one. I didn't mind. It was easier to take up less space, easier to fold myself into the corners of rooms while my brothers filled them with laughter, loud opinions, and the kind of charm people forgive too easily. After my mother died, I became a shadow in my own home. 14 is an impossible age to lose the one person who made you feel seen. I remember standing at the foot of her hospital bed, staring at her hand. The one that used to braid my hair, tuck handwritten notes into my lunchbox, and feeling like something had been unplugged inside me. She didn't leave a will. She left a daughter, a few fading photographs, and a house full of ghosts. My father remarried less than a year later. Karen. Her name was Karen. I learned quickly that I should call her that, and not Mom. She never said it directly, but some things don't need to be spoken to be understood. She wore perfume that smelled like white lilies and expensive spite. Her eyes only softened for my father, and even then, only when they were being watched. With her came new rules, new silences, new reminders that I was lucky to have a roof, lucky to have food, lucky to be tolerated. But I wasn't unloved, because I still had her. My grandmother. She lived 20 minutes away on Sycamore Hill, in a house that always smelled like cardamom and lemon polish. There were always fresh flowers in the foyer and dust jackets on all the books. That house felt like breathing after a long choke. She never asked me to explain myself. She just made me tea and let me talk. Or not talk. She understood both. "Worry they don't see you," she once said, as we watched my cousins run wild through her rose garden. But I do. I always will. When she got sick, I visited more. Every weekend, then every other day. I bathed her when the aides couldn't. I read her favorite poetry by the window, Yeats and Auden, and, sometimes, her own scribbled notes. She told me stories about my mother. Things my father never had the courage to remember out loud. And in her final weeks, she whispered something. "I still hear when the world gets too loud. The house is yours now. It's always been for you." I nodded. I believed her. I didn't think I needed to worry. At the funeral, my father cried in front of everyone. His speech was polished, the kind of eulogy that gets polite praise and a few damp tissues. My brothers looked somber. Karen wore black like she was born in it. I remember standing beside the casket, fingers clutched around a small white envelope the lawyer had handed me. I hadn't opened it yet. I didn't want to during the burial, but something about the weight of it in my coat pocket gave me comfort. Later, at the wake, when I asked my father what would happen to the house, he gave me a warm, dismissive smile. "Don't worry about any of that. Let the lawyers handle it." I repeated the question weeks later. He chuckled. "It's complicated, sweetheart. These things take time." My brothers echoed him. "Trust the process. There's a lot of red tape." Karen? She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. The way her eyes skimmed past mine, the way she always left the room when I brought it up, that was her answer. Still, I trusted them. That was my mistake. I took a modest job at a small publishing house. Proofreading, mostly. Nothing glamorous, but it paid the rent on my little apartment. And I liked the quiet. I liked being surrounded by stories that didn't ask me for anything. didn't splurge. I didn't touch the little inheritance I'd received in the first wave of estate handling. I assumed the house would come later, once things were finalized. That was what they'd said. So I waited. I lit candles on her birthday. I visited Sycamore Hill once, stood at the gate, and promised I'd come back soon. It looked the same back then. Roses crawling up the trellis, wind chimes singing above the porch, curtains drawn neatly across the front windows. Her presence still lingered in the air, like she was watching, waiting. But time passed. One season blurred into the next. Then came promotions, babies, house sales. My brothers bought new SUVs. Karen started wearing jewelry with designer tags still hanging from them. My father suddenly had a new investment property in Napa. I didn't question it, not out loud. I reminded myself they had their own lives. I was doing fine. The house would come. That was the plan. But it never did. Because while I was waiting for them to keep their word, they were cashing it. They took my legacy and polished it into a listing price. They walked through those rooms. Rooms I dusted and cried in and loved in, and measured their worth in dollars, not memories. They sat in some office, signed some papers, shook hands with realtors, and split the money like it was theirs to divide. They never asked, never told me. Because somewhere along the line, they decided that I didn't matter enough to include. I wasn't family. I was a footnote. I see it now. The signs were there, in Karen's cold silences, in my father's forced smiles, in the way my brothers changed the subject every time I brought up the house. They saw me the way people see wallpaper, present but not important, decorative, optional, something they could paint over once they were ready to renovate. But I wasn't just wallpaper. That house was mine. And the moment I found out what they did, something inside me, something old and quiet and very tired, snapped, not with rage, with clarity. I didn't dress up for the lawyer's office. I wore what I had on. Jeans, a sweater I'd worn too many times to count, and the coat I once wrapped around my grandmother's shoulders when the autumn wind made her bones ache. It still smelled, faintly, of her lavender lotion. I wore it like armor. The receptionist smiled the kind of tight-lipped smile reserved for people who show up without appointments. I said my name quietly. She typed something, asked me to wait. I sat in the corner, watching the shadows of strangers flicker against the frosted glass. Everyone here had some paperwork between them and their peace. I wondered if anyone else was about to find out their entire life had been signed away with a forged signature. When the lawyer finally brought me in, I could barely feel my feet. My legs carried me like someone else's, like I was watching myself. From above, a polite woman with trembling hands and steady eyes. He laid out the truth without much ceremony. The original will existed. It had my name on it. Sole heir of the property at Sycamore Hill. But it had never been submitted to probate. It was replaced, he said, sliding a manila envelope across the table. Your father submitted a new will. This one didn't include your name. I opened the folder with careful fingers. Each page cut deeper than the last. I saw the forged signature, an imitation of my grandmother's elegant hand, a mockery of her final promise to me. It wasn't a mistake. It was theft. Not of money, not of property, but of memory, of trust, of the last thing I had left that felt like mine. I looked up at the lawyer. Is there anything I can do? He hesitated. If you can prove the will was forged, yes. But you'll need evidence, witnesses, and it will be a fight. I nodded. That was all I could do. I don't remember driving home. Only the moment I shut my apartment door behind me and sank to the floor like my body had forgotten how to hold itself up. I pulled out the old photo albums, the ones my grandmother had given me the year I turned 18. Inside were memories, pressed between plastic sleeves. Faded birthday cards, recipes in her handwriting, photos of us baking, laughing, sitting on the porch swing while the sun dipped behind the hills. And then, there it was. A photo of me, maybe 8 years old, sitting on the staircase of Sycamore Hill in a yellow dress. My grandmother's arms around me, my head on her shoulder. That banister was where I learned to braid my hair. That hallway was where I whispered secrets to the walls, trusting they'd never repeat them. And now it belonged to strangers. No, not strangers. Thieves in familiar skin. I clutched the photo to my chest. The grief came like a flood. It choked me, stole the air from my lungs, made my ribs feel too tight for my own heart. I sobbed until I collapsed sideways, still holding the photo like it could keep me afloat. The next morning I called my father. He picked up after 2 rings. Sophia. That was all he said. No greeting, no warmth, just the flat weight of my name. I know, I said, voice like glass. There was a pause, then a sigh, like he was tired. He was tired. It was better this way, he said. You wouldn't have known what to do with that kind of money. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was absurd. He was the one who told me to let the lawyers handle it, the one who kissed my forehead at the funeral and said, "She loved you so much," the one who told everyone I was the heart of the family. Now I realized that was all performance. I was the decoration, the prop. The quiet daughter doesn't fight. She waits. She trusts. She disappears. Not anymore. I didn't cry after that call. I sat on my bed in silence, staring at the ceiling, one hand resting on the photo beside me. My grandmother had taught me many things: how to bake shortbread from scratch, how to read people's silences, how to walk away with dignity even when your knees are shaking. But the most important thing she ever taught me: people will tell you who they are. Believe them the first time. And now, finally, I did. I believed the coldness in my father's voice. I believed the silence from my brothers. I believed the dismissiveness from Karen. They had looked at me, measured my worth, and decided I didn't count. That I wouldn't fight. That I wouldn't know what to do with the truth. They were wrong. Because beneath the heartbreak, beneath the grief, beneath the gaping wound of betrayal, something else had started to stir. Something small and bright and dangerous. Not rage. Not revenge. Resolve. That night, I took out a notebook. I wrote everything down. Dates, names, statements, what the lawyer said, what my father said, who I remembered being present when the will was discussed. I made a list of everyone who had seen my grandmother in her final days. I listed the aides, the nurses, her church friends, the old neighbor across the street who used to bring her pie every Sunday. I wasn't sure yet what I would do with it all, but I knew I needed it. Because stories like mine don't make headlines. They rot in silence. They become whispered warnings at brunch tables and private Facebook messages that begin with, "Do you know what they did to her?" No. This story wouldn't rot. It would rise. I still didn't know how to prove the forgery. I didn't know where the money went, how many hands it passed through, or how many lies were baked into the documents. But I knew who I was now. I wasn't the quiet girl anymore. I was the rightful heir to a stolen life. And I had just found the fire buried under my silence. They thought they buried me. They didn't realize I was a seed. I didn't leave a note, not because I didn't have things to say, but because they weren't worth the ink. One morning, I just left. I turned off my phone, packed only what fit into 2 suitcases, canceled my lease, walked out of that apartment, like it was the shell of a woman I no longer recognized. There was no dramatic exit, no slammed doors, Just the sound of my own footsteps on the stairs, the cold breath of winter brushing my neck, and the faint click of my car door as I shut it behind me. 3 hours later, I arrived in a town no one in my family had ever heard of. A friend from college, Jules, had offered me her grandmother's old cottage when I told her vaguely that I needed space. It was barely standing. The porch leaned to the left. The paint was chipped. The kitchen sink groaned when you turned it on too fast. The heater rattled like bones. But it was mine. And for the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts. Slept for almost 2 days straight. My body collapsing under the weight of months, maybe years, of tension. When I finally woke, I opened every window and let the cold in. Let it wash over my skin like penance. Then I found an old journal in my bag, brown leather, cracked spine, and began to write. Not for anyone. Not for evidence. Not even for healing. I wrote because I had nowhere else to put the pain. Dear Grandma, I'm sorry I wasn't stronger. I'm sorry I trusted them. I'm sorry I didn't fight sooner. I miss the way your house smelled in the morning. Coffee, floor polish, and the ghost of Sunday perfume. I didn't sign it. I just closed the cover and slid it under my pillow. Every day, I wrote her another letter. Some a few lines, others pages long. It was the only way I could speak without crumbling. I got a part-time job at a bookstore downtown. The owner, Miriam, was in her 60s. Wide-brimmed glasses, soft gray curls. She never asked too many questions. Just handed me a key, showed me how to use the register, and said, "People don't come here for new books. They come for quiet." I stacked shelves, swept the floors, read poetry during my breaks, and let the silence wrap itself around me like a second skin. Every night, I cooked something small, soups, stews, grilled cheese. I ate at the tiny kitchen table facing the woods, watched deer pass by in the early dark, let the stillness work its way into my bones. Miriam invited me to an all-women's group one Thursday evening. I almost said no, but something in her eyes told me I wouldn't regret it. It wasn't what I expected. There were 6 of us, all women, different ages, different stories. One had lost everything to a manipulative husband. Another had signed away her rights to the family farm. One was still fighting her ex in court over a life insurance policy. They didn't cry. They didn't rage. They just talked. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't alone. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't start with the house, or the will, or the check. I said, "My name is Sophia." I trusted people who used my silence against me. And they nodded, because they understood. I started researching. At night, after work, I curled up on the old corduroy couch with a blanket and my laptop, and read everything I could find. Probate law, inheritance fraud, the statutes of limitations, case studies. I printed articles, highlighted names, annotated everything. I began documenting every text, every voicemail, every bank statement I could dig up. I messaged former neighbors, asked questions, found a nurse who remembered my grandmother signing the will in front of her, and then refusing to update it later. Bit by bit, I was building a case, not just legal, but emotional. A story, one that made sense, one that proved I hadn't imagined the betrayal, that I hadn't been crazy or naive or selfish, just blind, and even that was fading. Something strange happened, around week 5. I stopped apologizing, not just out loud, but in my head. I stopped saying, "I should have known." I stopped thinking. Maybe I overreacted. I stopped whispering. It's my fault, because it wasn't. I had trusted people who taught me to believe love meant obedience, that family meant silence, that money was too dirty a word for girls who wanted to be seen as good. But my grandmother never thought that way. She gave me the house because she believed in my future, because she saw the fire under the ash, because she knew what I was made of. And now, I remembered too. I started waking up earlier, walking the forest trails behind the house with a thermos of coffee in one hand and a growing sense of self in the other. The air tasted clean, cold, honest, like the first inhale after a long cry. One morning, as the sun cracked through the trees, I whispered, "I'm coming back for what's mine. Not to the world, not to the trees, to myself. Because that woman, the one who'd swallowed her voice for 28 years, was gone. I buried her beneath the roots of this quiet place, wrapped her in my old fears and the last apology I'd ever give, and I walked away with a sharper spine. The rain had been falling all afternoon, tapping against the windows like a metronome. Slow, relentless, unbothered by time. I sat on the floor, back against the bookshelf, a fireproof box open in front of me. Inside, a few printed emails, bank statements, an old photograph of me and Grandma on the porch steps, and the original will. The one with her cursive signature at the bottom and my name etched clearly, undeniably, into its center. Not a whisper. Not a maybe. She'd left it to me. I traced my name with the pad of my finger. It felt like touching a scar I'd grown to. Respect. That night, I wrote an email to a law firm I'd been researching for months. They specialized in contested estates and inheritance fraud. A small firm, female-led, fierce in a quiet way. I didn't overthink it. I didn't wait until I felt brave. I just hit send. 2 days later, they called. Her name was Ava. She didn't rush me. Let me tell the story. Every humiliating piece of it, without once interrupting. She didn't gasp or offer false sympathy. She took notes. And when I finished, she exhaled and said one sentence that changed everything. We can fight this. Not, you might have a case. Not, this could be difficult. But we. And fight. Like I wasn't alone anymore. Like my pain had finally found a shape that could strike back. I moved back to the city. Quietly. No announcements. No social media. Just an anonymous apartment a few blocks from the courthouse and a long coat that made me invisible in crowds. From the outside, it looked like I was starting over. From the inside, it felt like I was hunting. I pulled every thread I could. The house had sold for $4 million. The money had gone into a trust under my father's name, then quickly dispersed across 3 accounts. Each brother got $1 million. The rest? A new Tesla, private school tuition, a beach house bought in the name of his second wife, for the family. I printed deeds, traced wire transfers, requested digital copies of tax records and found the paper trail. They weren't even careful. Because they didn't think I mattered. I volunteered at a legal nonprofit twice a week, answered phones, organized files. In exchange, I asked questions, listened, shadowed meetings, studied the way attorneys spoke. Calm, unflinching, surgically precise. I watched a woman negotiate a settlement for a disabled client and saw how power didn't have to be loud. Sometimes it was silence that held the blade. I learned what constructive fraud meant, learned how to file a motion, how to write an affidavit. I was preparing a case, but also a new language, one they couldn't silence. Ava and I met twice a week to prepare. She reviewed my documentation, helped me gather sworn affidavits, neighbors, my grandmother's nurse, even her old pastor, who remembered the conversation about the house. Cataloged everything, outlined damages. We weren't just fighting for the return of property. We were suing for fraud, forgery, emotional distress, breach of fiduciary duty. My name went on every page, not in the corner. not as a footnote, at the top. When the summons were delivered, the shift was immediate. My brother called me 2 hours later. His voice was all fake warmth and guilt-dipped charm. "Soph, come on. You know how things got complicated after Grandma passed. Let's sit down, talk it out like a family." I almost laughed. "I tried that. 2 years ago. You left me on red." I hung up. The next day, a formal letter arrived from my father's lawyer. It was polite. Overly so. A sugar-coated threat, urging dispute resolution and amicable closure. I forwarded it to Ava. She drafted our response in under an hour. It was sharp, factual, backed with dates, bank figures, and a neat little signature at the bottom. Mine. The day we filed the case, I stood in my tiny apartment, holding the bottle of perfume my grandmother left me. I hadn't opened it since the funeral. The label was faded, the glass cool in my hands. I spritzed once, onto the wrist, let it bloom. It smelled of violets and worn wood. The hallway. Her scarves. The chest in her room I wasn't allowed to open until I was old enough to understand legacy. I was old enough now, and I understood it completely. I began walking differently after that, back straight, eyes forward. No more shrinking. My family didn't know who they were dealing with anymore. They'd built their legacy on arrogance, entitlement, and assumption. But mine was built on silence, on waiting, on carefully turned pages and scars folded into the lining of my coat. They'd cashed out their guilt. I'd invested my grief. And now I was about to collect, with interest. I arrived at the courthouse 15 minutes early. The city was loud, but I wasn't. I wore a black dress, simple, strong, and my grandmother's gold pendant tucked just above my collarbone. Her initials rested on my skin like armor. When I stepped into the courtroom, my breath caught. My father was already seated at the front, grayer than I remembered, shoulders curved forward like something had caved in. My brothers sat beside him. Both avoided my eyes. I didn't look away. I took my seat behind Ava. She turned briefly and gave me a small nod. "Ready?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew I was. The trial lasted 6 days. The truth took its time, like justice does. Ava began with the will, the signature mismatch, the missing witnesses, the sudden updated version filed weeks after my grandmother's death. Then came the timeline, the sale, the money transfers, the purchases made within days of the deposit. Names, dates, deeds. A paper trail so damning it barely needed narration. But she narrated it anyway, with the precision of someone slicing through lies. On day 4, it was my turn. I took the stand and swore to tell the truth. I didn't look at my family as I spoke. I looked at the judge. I was 14 when my mother died. My grandmother became everything to me. She used to say, "This house knows your footsteps." I smiled then. Not for effect, but because I remembered. I was never told the house was sold. I was never consulted. Not until I saw a listing online, photos of strangers in rooms I once called home. I showed the judge the photos. My old bedroom repainted beige. The staircase stripped of the green runner Grandma never wanted replaced. I showed her the letter I found tucked in my desk drawer. The original will. My name, circled in blue ink. I paused, took a breath. "They thought I wouldn't fight," I said. Because I was quiet. Because I trusted them. Because I let them talk over me at every dinner table. I looked at my father then. But silence is not submission. It never was. The verdict came the following week. It was a short statement. Calm, final, the court found the will was knowingly forged. The deed to the house was returned to me. Full restitution of the $4 million was ordered, with additional damages for emotional distress and breach of fiduciary duty. Criminal proceedings for the forged will would follow. I didn't cry. I didn't smile either. It wasn't victory I felt. It was release. A long exhale I'd been holding since the day my aunt made that comment in the kitchen. My family didn't speak to me afterward. No apology. No attempt at reconciliation. Only silence. And for once, I welcomed it. 2 months later, I stood at the threshold of the house. My house. The key turned with a soft click. The air inside smelled like dust and memory. Familiar, faint. The floors creaked the same. The walls still held the ghost of old wallpaper, faded where the sun always hit hardest. I didn't renovate. I restored. I found the same floral pattern Grandma had chosen in 1989. Repaired the hall mirror frame with gold leaf, just like she did every spring. Left the chipped step on the staircase because it had always squeaked when someone snuck in late. And in the back left corner of the living room, where a broken lamp once stood, I built a bookshelf, filled it with the stories I had once buried. Stories of women like me, quiet women, strong women, survivors. I hosted a dinner that fall, just 3 of us, Miriam, my boss from the bookstore, and a woman I'd met through the support group. Divorced, left bankrupt, now rebuilding. The table was simple, linen napkins, candles that smelled like cedar. I served soup in Grandma's old bowls. We toasted with ginger wine. To the house, I said, raising my glass. And to every woman who was erased. I paused, felt the words settle like roots in my chest. May she rise again, room by room. That night, I walked barefoot through the hallway, the same way I used to as a child. I stood in front of the mirror, touched the pendant at my neck. The house didn't feel empty anymore. It felt righted, like something that had tilted for 2, long had finally settled back into place. I whispered into the stillness. I came back, Grandma. And I remembered who I was. The walls didn't answer. But I swear, I heard the floorboards sigh. End.